Welcome back once again for this presentation on the Puritans in New England, America's city upon a hill. Now, we've already talked a little bit about the first permanent English colony, Jamestown, 1607. Now we're really looking at a group of colonies, the New England colonies, that will be established a few years later, but in some ways they have a claim to also be some of the most important colonies of all of those that the English would establish. These would include areas now like Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. We're mainly going to focus on Massachusetts and a little bit of Rhode Island here today. So, if you followed our intro music, we had the Eagles, one of America's most popular bands of all times in terms of record sales, and we'll look at the theme song was "Witchy Woman." We're not really going to be talking about the Salem witch trials in this, but we'll get to someone else that exemplifies that Eagles song here, at least in the minds of most people living in New England at the time. So, our purpose here today in this session is to talk about the what a Puritan was. And we want you to understand what the Puritans were and really how they are distinguished from pilgrims. There's a difference between people we call the pilgrims and Puritans. And Puritans a much broader term. The pilgrims were a very specific group that fall under the umbrella of Puritanism. So we want you to know who Puritans were. We'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics of the Pilgrims' experience. And then we will finally get to Puritans in Massachusetts and other parts of New England. So we'll make sure all this fits together by the end. Well, for starters, who were these Puritans? Well, the Puritans were, first of all, English Protestants. They are people from England who were not satisfied with the Protestant Reformation there. They wanted to see it go further than it had. A little review of English history is helpful here. England, of course, had broken from the Catholic Church when King Henry VIII was not given permission to have a divorce. So he establishes the Anglican Church, or the Church of England there, that he could be in charge of. But for many years, England's ruling religious group kind of bounced back and forth. After Henry VIII died, he had one son finally. Wife number 3 gave him a son, not a very healthy one. But there was a King Edward VI, for a brief period of time, and Edward was advised by real staunch Protestants that wanted to distance themselves from Catholicism. They wanted to do things very differently than the Catholics. And so the English population became more Protestant in those years. But as I said, Edward was not very healthy. He died still as a teenager. And now his half sister, Mary, became the queen. Mary was a staunch Catholic. She didn't like that her mother had been mistreated when she was cast away by the king, by her father, and she wanted to restore Catholicism to England. And so now suddenly the tables turned. Under Bloody Mary, it's the Protestants who are suffering and experiencing martyrdom. When Mary died, she didn't reign for very long either. It was her half sister, Elizabeth, that finally brings some order out of this chaos. Elizabeth doesn't want England's church to be extremely Catholic or extremely Protestant. She just wants it to be moderate, somewhere in the middle ground that will still establish the monarch's leadership of the church, but otherwise she doesn't want to be one of the more radical kinds of Protestants. Well, that's where this term Puritan comes from. The Puritans were people who thought Elizabeth was too weak. She's too moderate. Um, she's too Catholic. Well, technically, no, she's not Catholic, but the Puritans wanted church to be very different from what the Catholics had. They don't believe in a very hierarchical kind of religious structure. They believe that congregations of people select their own leaders. In fact, I think that's the next, yes, that's the next thing on the slide. They believe in congregationalism. Puritans were congregationalists. What I mean is, they don't believe in a church structure where a pope or an archbishop appoints ministers, appoints bishops and priests to various congregations. No, Puritans believe people choose their own minister. Each congregation is independent of all other congregations, and those Christians will decide who their minister is going to be. And they can fire ministers if they don't like them or they know that they're not teaching truth. So Puritans are English Protestants. They're also Protestants who believe in this more congregational form of organization, not really the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, not the hierarchy of the Anglican Church. Um, Theologically speaking, they were also Calvinists. They're followers of a reformer named John Calvin. You will have come across the name in the reading already, I'm sure. John Calvin was extremely important in the Protestant Reformation, right there along with Martin Luther. Only in American history, because there were a lot more Calvinists than Lutherans that came to America, he's probably even more important. Well, John Calvin, in his theology, he had taught that God is sovereign over all things. Nothing really happens in this world that God does not cause to happen or allow to happen. And because God is completely sovereign, it's really his decision on whether or not people are going to be saved or not saved. There's nothing people can do to make that happen. It's God, the sovereign of the universe. He decides to save whomever he wants. And if he does not intervene to save someone, no one deserves salvation. So when you hear Calvinism, probably the first concept that comes to mind is predestination. John Calvin didn't invent this concept, but it was certainly important in his theology. He believed people are predestined. They are either born predestined to be saved and spend eternity in heaven with God, or they are not. If God has not chosen them, if they are not among the elect, then there's nothing they can ever do to become saved and to join with the sovereign of all the universe. Again, Calvin doesn't invent that, and there were many Catholic theologians that taught a predestination as well. But it's really central to Puritan teaching, where they believe that people are either predestined to be saved and among the elect, or they are not. And there's nothing you can do to change that. You just have to hope and pray you are among the elect. Now, that was John Calvin's writings, the 1530s. It had been edited many times over the years, but the Puritans we're talking about come about almost a century later, and Calvin's writings had, um, had changed a bit, or others reading Calvin had also had thoughts on his theology. They also had ideas about God and man, and so Calvinism had evolved somewhat in the several decades since Calvin first wrote that down. And one of the evolutions that was very important to Puritans was this idea of covenant theology. A lot of Puritans had really emphasized covenants. God is a God of covenants. He makes agreements with people, he makes contracts with people. And because he makes these covenants, you can be assured that he will uphold his end of any covenant. And this made Calvinism a little more palatable. It made it seem less harsh and seem more humane, for lack of a better term. God is being humane. Um, Covenant theology emphasized that if people uphold their end of a bargain, God is certainly going to uphold his. So um, God has made covenants with people throughout history. He makes covenants with Adam. He breaks that in the Garden of Eden, or with Noah, build a boat and I will save your family. He makes covenants with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now Puritans were also emphasizing if we uphold the covenant, what God has expected of us, we know he will be faithful and he will save those whom he has chosen to save. Okay. Now, this is important here because um, many of us may misunderstand some of the predestination ideas. Some people hear this about Puritans and they say, if God has already decided who he's going to save and who he's not, then why don't we just party like it's 1599? Why don't we do whatever we want to do? Don't deny yourself anything at all, any physical pleasure, whatever you want. Rob people if that makes you happy, because God may have already chosen you to be among the saved. That's what people now might ask those questions. Puritans then, of course, understood that if God has chosen you, if you are among the elect, among the saved, those are not the kinds of inclinations you would have. You would not act in that very immoral, despicable, uh, hedonistic, selfish kind of way. No, no, God's people would be righteous people. Now, it doesn't mean that being righteous earns you salvation. Puritans are very clear about that. No one can earn their way to heaven. But if you are one of the chosen, you will live a righteous life. So, this is where that covenant idea becomes really important. If you are among the saved, if you hope to be one of those God has chosen, then you obviously are going to be living a righteous life. You cannot be hedonistic. You cannot live as if there is no such thing as sin. Puritans are very heavy on sin. They know that people are sinful, depraved creatures. But those that God has chosen to save will uphold his covenant. They will uphold godly, righteous laws. That made it seem a little more acceptable, these Calvinistic theologies. Okay, so this is a very broad view of who the Puritans were: English Protestants, Congregationalists, Calvinists. Now let's talk about one specific group of Puritans known as the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were also known as separatists. This was not all Puritans. This was a very specific group who were so against the Church of England that they separated from it completely. They did not believe it was a true church. Um, it's not a true church that just says because Henry VIII wanted a divorce and didn't get it, he started his own church. These separatists believe the Church of England is not the true church, and that only by separating from it, having their own congregational meetings where true Christians meet together and choose their own minister, that's the only real way to worship. So separatists were people who did not believe that they could reform the Anglican Church from within. They believed you have to completely get away from the Anglican Church in order to have a true church. Well, that was a radical position to have in England at this time, because that meant you're rejecting the authority of the king, the king's religious authority. So separatists were definitely going to be a targeted kind of people. It was one thing to have some puritanical views, hope to reform the church from within, but to completely separate meant you're rejecting the king's authority. Well, the group we call pilgrims were these separatists who um, did not like being under English rule, under the Church of England. And so a congregation, a group of them left England and moved across the English Channel to Holland, what we call the Netherlands now. Um, these separatists moved to Holland because there they could practice their religion how they wanted to. They would not be targets. They could choose their own minister, and their minister, John Robinson, preached there for this community. But they were outsiders there. They really weren't Dutch, and they weren't part of any Dutch working guilds. So they were struggling economically, and they um, they hoped to um, to prosper. And so for over a decade, they existed in Holland. They traveled there about the same time that the Jamestown colony was established. So 1607, they've moved to Holland. But after more than a decade there, they realized we're poor outsiders. It's not that the Netherlands are harassing them, they're just not really as well accepted either. So a group of them had this idea: join another joint stock company, join another corporation that's going to establish a colony in the New World. And that's what they do. Um, they join a group that was going to establish another colony. It's this same group or similar group to what had established Jamestown by the Virginia Company. Well, the whole congregation could not go. Some of them stayed behind in the Netherlands. Some others decide to go, but then, when two ships, one of the two ships was unseaworthy, they had to cut down the number of people who would go again. And eventually, one small part, so it's not all of this congregation, but a big chunk of this congregation that had moved to Holland together now got on board this famous ship, the Mayflower, and sailed to Plymouth. Now, keep in mind, they were not the only people on board this ship. They're not the only people coming to Plymouth. Plymouth is actually the town that they're leaving, and it's just going to become the new name of where they land. Plymouth is a port city in England. But the other portion of people on this ship, the Pilgrims just called the strangers. They were strangers to them. The strangers just were other parts of this company, other individuals who had decided to join this joint stock company to go and establish a colony. So imagine there's pilgrims or separatists who have lived together as families and have migrated together to Holland. And now there's these strangers too, groups of individuals. They don't all know each other, but here, pilgrims and strangers both on board the Mayflower, and they're going to come to the New World. They're going to come to the coast of Massachusetts and establish this colony of Plymouth. The picture here is actually taken from a recreated historical site that's called Plymouth Plantation. If you're ever in that area, just a little south of Boston, you should definitely visit. It's a really cool living history museum. And what they're trying to do is show what this colony would have looked like about 1626. So, they make buildings the way they would have looked then. This is what the village would have looked like in the mid 1620s. And it's really interesting mixing around with the people there, the actors, the historical actors there, because they act like it's the 1620s. They've never heard of Oklahoma or other places that you may say you've come from. And you'll talk to people there. Some will be among the pilgrims. Some will be the strangers. Some of them will have come not for religious purposes, but for just purposes of being part of a company. Others, though, the pilgrims, would have come for this more religious purpose and have religious community. Well, as I mentioned, the Mayflower is the name of this small vessel that they travel in. And because they're a mix of strangers and pilgrims or separatists, they have to come to some agreement on what this colony is going to be governed like, what's going to happen when they get off the Mayflower. So that's where the Mayflower Compact comes in. It's not a real detailed list of rules. The Mayflower Compact really just describes a colony. It describes how every member is going to have to work for the good of the whole. And they're going to have to work together to make this community work. The compact is another name for a contract or covenant. This is a covenant they're making with one another. Every member has to do their part in order for the whole to thrive. Okay. Now, there's lots of things, with more time, we could talk a lot more about this first group of pilgrims. I'm not going to do that. We're going to save more of our time for the larger group of Puritans. But there is one thing that we do have to address with both groups, and that is the question of religious freedom. Did the Pilgrims come to America for the purpose of religious freedom? I've got a question mark here because, well, it depends on what you mean by that. Okay. You have to remember these separatists were targeted in England because they've rejected the Church of England. They moved to Holland so that they could be free to worship how they want. And they were free to worship how they wanted in Holland. So in one sense, no, they haven't come here because they couldn't worship how they wanted back in Holland. They were free to worship as they wanted there. Now, they do want to come and worship in their way, congregational worship, Calvinistic theology. They do want to teach those doctrines. That's how they're going to establish the church in Plymouth. And by the way, the strangers may outnumber the pilgrims, but they don't really have more influence because they're all separate individuals. They're not families that already know each other and are tied together. So religious leadership in this community is definitely going to be dominated by the separatists, by that congregation who have fled to Holland together. Now they've come to the New World together. They dominate religiously. But here's the other part of religious freedom that we sometimes confuse with pilgrims. People will often say, these pilgrims are hypocrites because they want religious freedom for themselves, but they don't offer it to other people. They're not being true to their principles because they're not going to allow people to come and worship, as Quakers or, as Catholics or Muslims or any other group. They're not going to welcome that. Well, we have to remember the Pilgrims never said, Puritans never said, we are going to establish a colony where we can worship, where everyone can worship however they choose. No, that was never their goal. They've never said, we are trying to establish religious freedom for everyone. That's something more modern people might think they should have said. That was not their principle. They wanted to come and establish what they thought was a true, pure Christian community. But to have dozens of different opinions about what that Christian community ought to look like, or varieties of opinions on what that worship ought to look like, having every individual kind of choose to be a part or not a part of the religious community, Puritans never said that that's what they're about. So we have to be careful there. Did the Pilgrims come for religious freedom? Well, depends on what you mean. Of course, they want to have religious freedom to worship as they see fit, just as they had been doing in Holland. That's not really the reason they've left Holland. But they certainly don't stand for the principle of just religious freedom for all individuals. Do whatever you've decided is right. No, that would be going outside of a community covenant. and they wouldn't be for that at all. Well, let's skip ahead a little bit here to the larger group of Puritans that would come after these pilgrims. Plymouth gets a lot of attention because it is one of these early colonies. And of course, because it has this religious component, it gets a lot of attention too. Some people might say, ooh, what's more important, Jamestown, which comes first, or Plymouth? Because certainly those religious principles have a big impact on American history later on. Maybe that's even more important. Well, Plymouth gets a lot of attention, but it really was a small colony. Eventually, it's going to be absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this was a Puritan colony centered in Boston. So let's talk a little bit about this larger colony that will eventually absorb the Pilgrims as well. And they're similar because this is a Puritan colony. But these Puritans were not separatists. These were Puritans who wanted to change the Church of England from within. And we'll start here with this man whose portrait is pictured here, John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winthrop, off and on, was governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony from 1630 to 1650. There's elections every year. He was not always going to be governor, but quite often he would be the governor. And I want to focus on something he said when he was leaving England to come to the New World. John Winthrop was not a minister. He was a lawyer and a wealthy landowner in England, but he is part of this Puritan movement. He does not think the Anglican Church does things exactly the way they ought to. He does want to see congregational worship and congregational autonomy. He wants a church to really mean people who are of the elect, and not just everyone who's born in England being considered a Christian, being christened and immediately considered, well, you're part of Christendom. Puritans want to purify that church. They want simpler worship, not emphasis on great cathedrals and stained glass, but simple meeting houses and very morally righteous people worshiping inside. Well, John Winthrop tries to explain why he's leaving. He makes it clear he's not leaving the Church of England, but he does want to purify it. He does want to reform it. And so he gives what we would call a sermon, even though he's not a minister. He explains to people getting on the ship with him that they're going to establish a more perfect kind of community. And he explains in his speech that God has made a variety of kinds of people. God has made 5 talent people, 2 talent, 1 talent. He's made such a variety because that's the kind of God we worship. He is a creative being. He does not just make the same kind of thing over and over again. He makes a wonderful diversity of people. And Winthrop was saying, we are a diverse group. Now, we might look at them and say, they're all white Englishmen. That's not diverse. Well, he's not just thinking about race. He's thinking we are diverse because we're different personalities with different talents. Some are rich and some are poor. And Winthrop thought in a more perfect religious community, the rich would have responsibilities to the poor to help take care of them and not to abuse them. And the poor, they would have certain responsibilities to the rich as well. It would be their responsibility not to be rebellious and not to be jealous and try to overthrow people just because they have more than what you have. So Winthrop goes on to try to explain how this community should be like a single individual, but we're all different parts of that body. And then toward the end of the speech, he gets to this phrase, we shall be like a city upon a hill. We're going to be a light to the rest of the nations. Really, he's quoting Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. And he's talking about how this community that they're establishing in Boston is going to be a city upon a hill. It's going to be an example to other people what kind of community they ought to have, what a real Christian community should look like. And Winthrop says, if we do this very well, people in England are going to look to us and say, that's it. That's what a Christian community is really supposed to look like. It will be a model for people back in England to see these Puritan ways and embrace them. But he says, if they fail, if they can't live as one body, if they have dissension among them, then it'll be an embarrassment to Christianity. It will open the mouths of blasphemers to deny God or to ridicule his people. So, like a good Puritan, Winthrop takes on a very heavy responsibility here. He says, if we do this right in creating a colony, we will honor God. But if we mess up, it will be an embarrassment to God. It'll be a slap in the face to God. So don't mess this up. Be a good community. Now, that's his city upon a hill speech. These Puritans come not just as a group to make money, even though, yes, they were part of a company, just like Jamestown and Plymouth. This is a business that's supposed to be making money. But Winthrop makes it clear there's a higher mission in this colony. It's a mission to be a city upon a hill religiously. Well, let's say a little something about Puritan government. Puritans believe very strongly in government, and they believe that God established government because people are sinful. People need some sort of authority, because left to ourselves, Puritans would say, we are sinful, depraved people. It would not be a blissful colony, a blissful existence without some sort of governing authorities. But Puritans also thought, while God establishes civil government, he also established the church, and those two authorities have different roles: civil government and church. You see, if Winthrop was a minister of the church, then he could not be the governor. He could never have been governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Puritans believe that there is some separation between civil government and church authority. Now, remember, they've come after the Protestant Reformation, so they know that there are some dangers when the government and the church are just one and the same, as in medieval Europe. But they also see these things as complementary institutions. Civil government and church must work together toward a common end. So, for example, if a man was not providing for his family, if he was not upholding his part of a family covenant, he could be punished by civil authorities. And he could get punished by church authorities too. He may get kicked out of the church. Civil authority, church authority, they work hand in hand. If someone has committed adultery, obviously that is something that would get someone in trouble with their church. They would be disciplined by their church. But there would be civil laws against that as well. So when you talk about Puritan government, separation between church and state, you have to be very specific. They would have different ideas about that kind of separation than what we have in America today. They would have no problem with 10 commandments at a courthouse. Of course, they would think 10 commandments and biblical instruction informs our civil government. And they're going to have no problem having one church established there, the Congregational Church. That's it. They're not going to welcome other religious groups coming in among them and saying, well, here's a different standard. Here's a different religion for the community. There's going to be one only. For example, um, Baptists would be kind of related to Puritanism, but not what the majority were doing. Mainly, the difference would be in the practice of baptism. Who is that for? Well, most of these Puritans, they still baptized infants. Baptism for them was a way of passing on the covenant to the next generation. And a set of parents saying, we are among the elect, um, we are members of a church, and we are baptizing our children, hoping that that covenant will pass down to the next generation as well, much like circumcision in the Old Testament. They didn't see baptism as something that's washing away sins or something like that. Well, the groups we would call the Baptists, though, said baptism really should happen when a person is old enough to make that decision. It's not something that should happen to an infant. But most Puritans did practice infant baptism, and they don't welcome this other opinion that says baptism is for a believer. And if you're not old enough to believe, then you can't, and then baptism means nothing. Okay, Puritans established congregational Christian churches, and they're not going to tolerate these differences that would be a breaking up of this model city upon a hill. Okay. Let me end with a couple of dilemmas that the Puritans would have in their early days. The first dilemma centers around Roger Williams. Roger Williams was one of the first ministers, Puritan ministers, to come into Massachusetts. He came in 1631, so just a year after John Winthrop and company arrive. But right away, Roger Williams made waves. His views were more like the separatists. Everywhere that he went to be a minister, and he worked in Salem for a little while, he worked in Boston, he worked in Plymouth as well, and everywhere he went, he insisted the congregation needs to declare themselves not a part of the Church of England, declare themselves to be separatists. Well, that was a more radical position. That was going to potentially bring more negative attention on this colony that other Puritans did not welcome. So that's one thing that will get Roger Williams in trouble. Another thing that gets him in trouble is Williams really didn't believe that the king had any authority to just say, this land is yours. For Roger Williams, this land belongs to the Native Americans. And so unless they have agreed and know what they're agreeing to, unless those natives have agreed to sell you the land, it's not really England's. Now, that's something that makes Roger Williams more popular with modern Americans. He seems to have more open and liberal ideas about the dignity of the Indians. He's advocating actually purchasing land from the natives, that it's really their land. Another thing that makes Roger Williams seem like a more modern kind of man, Williams didn't believe that there should be just that one established church and everyone had to follow and obey it. All others are unwelcome. Roger Williams believed in a greater separation between church and state, where the state can't really define what the church should be, define what true Christianity really was. So his views on Indians, his views on church-state separation make Roger Williams seem like a much more modern man. But he's very much a man of the 17th century, not the 21st century. Williams, his views on church and state, his views on king's authority were actually very conservative. He goes back to his view on the whole Protestant Reformation. To Roger Williams, the pure Christian church had been tainted by centuries of Catholicism. Basically, he believed that the church you read about in the New Testament, that was a pure church described in all these different places where the apostles were spreading Christianity. But once Christianity became the official church, the official religion of the Roman Empire, it was tainted, that it was corrupted. You know, in Roger Williams' mind, anywhere that Christianity had to be supported by civil authorities, it was corrupted. So that was the lesson in history to him, is that for centuries, the Catholic Church had become the only acceptable religion throughout medieval Europe, and it was no longer a true church. Now, he believed the Protestant reformers had tried to fix that, but he still was not really sure that anyone now can say, we are that first century church. He believed that, whether Martin Luther, John Calvin, other reformers might have had good intentions, but who can really say we are following in the paths of the Apostle Peter and Paul, and our church is really what that first century church was? Roger Williams was unsure that anyone could really make that claim. Now, obviously, he thought the Puritans were getting closer than anyone else. That's why he's among them. But he wants to make it clear he's not a member of the Church of England anymore, that's not truly a church. So Roger Williams made himself a nuisance in New England until he was eventually put on trial, and other civil authorities decided to kick him out. Now, John Winthrop was not governor at that moment, and in fact, most think John Winthrop might have actually warned Roger Williams, "You're about to get kicked out. You're going to be sent back to England." And if he was sent back to England, he would probably be executed there, because he's saying very harsh things about limitations on the king's authority and his religious authority, his authority to give land. So it may have been John Winthrop that warns Roger Williams, and Williams just runs away. He leaves Massachusetts, stays with Native Americans who he had good relations with, and ends up establishing a new town of Providence, Rhode Island. To him, it was providential that he should come to that place. And years later, he'll get his own charter for a new colony, and we'll have the Rhode Island colony, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, the full name. So that was one dilemma that the Puritans had, how to handle Roger Williams. And that was just 1636. The colony was still very new when they're having this dilemma. Now we finally get to our theme song, Witchy Woman, and see a much bigger Puritan dilemma. This one centers around the person of Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was also an early Puritan settler, a very religious woman, and she had, in fact, hosted a very popular Bible study at her house. That's not what's going to get her in trouble. It's not going to be because a woman hosted a religious meeting. What do Puritans do outside of going to worship service through the week? They have lots of other religious meetings, and they discuss what happened in the Sunday's sermon. So it was not unusual for women to be hosts of a meeting like this. What got her in trouble are rumors of what she was saying at these meetings. Many people said Anne Hutchinson is critical of almost every minister in New England. They say she was saying that most ministers in Massachusetts are teaching salvation by works instead of salvation by grace. Now, any Calvinist knows that's heresy. No one can be saved by works. It is only by grace that you are saved. So, if it's true, if the rumor is true, what she's saying, she's really accusing Puritan ministers of teaching heresy. So, because of these rumors, she was brought before a panel of Puritan ministers, and that's kind of what you're seeing here, um, to answer for her um, religious convictions. Now, she becomes a modern day hero for a lot of people. For a lot of feminists, look to Anne Hutchinson and say she's an iconic hero because she's going to stand up in front of this all male group and not be fearful and speak very plainly and boldly of her convictions. But I, this is another case, I think, in which we're interpreting history very strangely in order to make her a feminist hero. Anne Hutchinson had followed her favorite minister to New England. She and her husband, they loved the minister John Cotton, and John Cotton had talked about the role of husbands and the role of wives in a very conservative way. You know, John Cotton taught that women were made as the helpmeet of man. Wives were subordinate to their husbands. They were helpers, but they were under his leadership. Anne Hutchinson didn't seem to have a problem with any of those teachings. So it's not that she had 21st century views on male and female equality. But what gets her in trouble here is in these meetings in front of the other ministers, Anne Hutchinson says that she knows where she can tell who is saved and who is not by a voice from God. Interesting. She claims she can tell who is saved and who is not. It's not by who's doing good works. It's not by who God is blessing through material prosperity. She knows because God reveals it to her. Now, this definitely makes Puritan ministers sit up. What do you mean God revealed something to you? Well, she says it's in a voice. God speaks to her as he spoke to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, for this panel of ministers, that was enough. For an individual to claim, God speaks directly to me, I have that kind of personal access to God, that was a recipe for complete disaster in this community. And the Puritan ministers right away knew she must get out of the colony. This whole controversy was known as the antinomian crisis, and that fancy old word just means anti-authority. These Puritan ministers were saying Anne Hutchinson's teachings would destroy all authority. If any individual could just claim God has spoken to me, then why would I need to listen to my minister? Why would I need to listen to any civil authorities? If I have direct line to God, then I'm above all other human authority. That's what worries a lot of these Puritan ministers. Anne Hutchinson, the conclusion of her teachings is that God is communicating directly with certain individuals. And that means we don't have to follow other rules, other laws, listen to ministers if you have that direct access to God. So Anne Hutchinson will not only be pronounced out of the colony, she will have a meeting with her congregation as well. There'll be the civil authority trial, there'll be a church trial. And her congregation at least hopes that she'll renounce some of what she's said. She speaks a little bit softer to them, but they also are going to conclude, yes, you must be excommunicated. You must be kicked out of our congregation. So sadly for Anne Hutchinson, she was very pregnant at this time, and yet they're still going to say she's got to get out of Massachusetts. She is a dangerous, witchy woman. Well, they didn't say it exactly like that, but if they had the Eagles theme music, they might have said it like that. Anne Hutchinson is going to have to leave Massachusetts. And where can a person in Massachusetts go if they've been deemed unworthy to stay in this religious colony? Well, now they have Rhode Island to go to. and she will go close to where Roger Williams had been, and she will also reside in Rhode Island for a while. She had many children, grown children too, and when she finally has this child that she had been carrying through the trial, people in Massachusetts are going to be very interested to hear what happens. She doesn't have a living child. She has something that was kind of described as a mass of tissue that looked like a cluster of clear grapes, a miscarriage of some sort, but brought all the way to full, the full 9 months, full term. Well, for Puritans who believe God is in charge of everything, nothing happens that God has not allowed or caused to happen, there's a simple lesson here. This is an evil, witchy woman, and God has punished her by this grotesque, what should have been a human child. Several years later, that was 1638, but when you get to the 1650s, Anne Hutchinson had moved away from Rhode Island. She actually lived in a Dutch colony of New Netherlands, and there was an Indian war there. And even though Anne Hutchinson was not Dutch, she's not really part of that whole conflict. She was a victim in this Indian war in the New Netherlands. People back in Massachusetts will remember the Antinomian crisis. They'll remember Anne Hutchinson, and they will again conclude this is God's punishment of this woman who had such a disastrous kind of teaching that God may speak directly through individuals. That would certainly be a recipe for destroying the singular community purpose, the mission purpose of a city upon a hill. That's it for Puritans here. Thanks for listening, and we will continue more soon. So stay tuned. Bye-bye.